very warm welcome to everyone this afternoon to the 8th Holocaust Memorial Day lecture. Today's lecture will be given by Dr. Martin Stern from Leicester, who is a survivor of the Holocaust. We're delighted and honoured that you, Martin, have agreed to talk to us this afternoon. I'm delighted that you were able to accept our invitation and that you'll be speaking to us in a moment. Holocaust Memorial Day 2010 marks the 65th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp by the Red Army on the 27th of January 1945. But this International Day of Remembrance covers more than the Holocaust, unfortunately. It's a day of remembrance for the victims and survivors, not only of the Holocaust, but of subsequent genocides. And these include, to name just a few, in Cambodia, in Bosnia, in Rwanda, and in Darfur. Have we learned our lesson? Have we learned any lesson from the Holocaust? These are the questions, difficult questions, that our speaker will ask today and give us some insight, being himself a survivor. As in previous years, the Holocaust Memorial Trust has chosen a special theme for Holocaust Memorial Day. This year's theme is the legacy of hope. Hope for a safer and more inclusive society, accompanied by a clear no to hate, exclusion, racism, prejudice, and discrimination. Today we're privileged to listen to a voice from the Holocaust and Nazi persecution. Martin Stern will share with us his memories and his thoughts about the Holocaust, about the lessons we have to learn, and if we can dare to hope for a better future. Once again, very warm welcome to all of you, and may I welcome Martin Stern to the stage.
Well, thank you, Vice-Chancellor and Professor Dieter Steinert, for asking me to speak. I'm not sure that by the end of this talk you will all be thanking them, but we'll see. The Jewish people, in not so long a time from now, will be celebrating the festival of Passover, we call it Pesach. It commemorates attempted genocide. The Egyptians tried to destroy the Jewish people by overwork and terrible working conditions. One might have called it Vernichting durch Arbeit. And they then tried to massacre all the male children, and finally they tried to smash up the children of Israel at the Red Sea. So we get together once a year to commemorate that event, and we're still learning lessons from it. In fact, learned commentators are still writing new versions of what we call the Haggadah, the book that we use to run that service, with their own new commentaries 5,000 years later. And we're still learning. Those commentaries, let me tell you, are worth reading. So, when we're considering the lessons of the Holocaust, let me start that the way that we do our Passover service. I'll start by telling you a story. Until a few years ago, I was a consultant clinical immunologist in the hospitals in Leicester, and I was treating people with asthma and with allergic diseases, and I'm married and I had 3 children, but it wasn't always like that. I was born in the Netherlands, and in 1938. My dad was an architect, and he was also a Jew. My mother was not Jewish. They came from Germany. My father was born in Germany in Berlin in 1911. So I grew up in the Netherlands. It was invaded by the German Empire. And when I was 5, I found myself at a sort of nursery school one day. We weren't doing anything as sophisticated as reading and writing. That was not, let alone the sort of stuff you learn at the University of Wolverhampton. We were just folding bits of paper and playing games, doing exercises and singing songs. And our teacher had taken us to the little hall of the little school. It was just a converted house, really, and lined us up against a wall in preparation for one of these sort of activities. And the door opened. 2 young men walked in. And one of them said, "Is Martin Stern here?" And the teacher immediately answered, "No, he hasn't come in today." And there I was, standing against the wall, all of 5 years old. And I didn't know what was going on. I put my hand up and I said, "But I am here." I'll never forget the look on the teacher's face as I looked around whilst those 2 young men were leading me out of the hall. They took me outside. They had their bikes leaning against the lamppost. They put me on the back of one of those bikes, the way people do in Holland, and off they cycled with me through Amsterdam to a rather fine, big red brick building. It had been a school. It's still there. The Germans had just booted out the pupils and the teachers, and they turned it into the interrogation center for the Amsterdam district. I was led up some steps into the school and a staircase to the first floor and into a large, it seemed to me, huge office. And in the middle of this office there was one desk, a very elaborate, ornate desk. The room, I know, had been the headmaster's office, and I don't think that desk had belonged to the headmaster. I think it was stolen from a rich Jewish family in Amsterdam. Behind the desk was a rather fat man in a green German military uniform. He would have been a member, I didn't know it then, of the Sicherheitsdienst, the security service, a branch of the same organization as the Gestapo, and responsible under the Nazi regime in occupied countries for the rounding up and deportation of Jews. And he started asking me questions. By this time I had some questions of my own. When would I be allowed to go home? When could I go back to school? And this man sort of explained to me as if he expected me, 5 years old, to be sorry for him. He just had his job to do. Those questions were not the things he was allowed to be concerned with. His job was just to find out whether I was the Martin Stern that he was looking for. In fact, he presented himself like any bureaucrat I've met since. Almost. As soon as he had his answer, he ordered another man to take me out into the corridor, the school corridor, loads of doors off it, all closed, except one. And as I was led past this open door, I could see into a small room. On the far wall was a map. And looking at the map with his back to me was a man, one man. I knew who it was. It was the man who, with his wife, had had me in his flat in Amsterdam for 2 years and treated me as his own son. And I called out to him. That's all they wanted. I was dragged away. I was not allowed to say another word, let alone go to him. They just wanted confirmation that I could recognize him instantly, even from behind. How did things get to that stage? Well, my grandfather, as I said, was born in Berlin in 1911. His father, my grandfather, ran a large women's clothing business in the center of Berlin. There he made women's coats and sold them all over Europe. And in fact, at some stage, they were preparing to open a branch in New York. This was a successful business. They owned a picture by Van Gogh. Another one that they thought was by Van Gogh, it was a fake, but never mind, it was a nice thing. And a picture by Matisse, which currently is the property of the City Art Gallery in Amsterdam, the Stedelijk Museum. It's a beautiful odalisque. And the Van Gogh, by the way, there's a photograph of it hanging in my hall in Leicester. You know, the Van Gogh painting in the Louvre, the Souvenir de Mauve. Van Gogh painted 14 of those, and that was one of the others. You know, not all the same, but a series on that theme. Ours wasn't as good as the Louvre's, but it was a lovely painting. And for years after the war, I lived with that painting when we had a meal in the dining room that was hanging on the wall. It became uninsurable, and we had to get rid of it. They had a house full of Chinese antiques. They were knowledgeable about classical music. They were great friends with their neighbors. The man was an art dealer, one of the pioneer art dealers. And their daughter was a talented classical musician who played with the Berlin Philharmonic at the age of 16. My father, of course, being born in 1911, was too young to fight in the First World War. He was only a little lad. But he had a much older brother who did fight in the German army in the First World War. And a friend of the family, in fact, a son of that neighboring family, told me after the war that when this older brother came home from the front on leave, one of the first things he would do was take his little kid brother, my dad, into the garden and show him how to dig a trench. These people were fully committed Germans. They were nominally Jewish. I guess they probably somehow observed the three main festivals of the year. But at Christmas, they had a Christmas tree in the house because everybody else had one, and it's so nice for the children. You wouldn't do that if you were a strictly observant Orthodox Jew. So they weren't. And my father and his siblings really grew up as atheists. Not only did my father's older brother fight in the German army in the First World War, but he was called Wilhelm. And I always ask school children who come to listen to me, do you know anybody else in Germany at the time of the First World War who was called Wilhelm? And they do. And I don't know that my grandparents called him Wilhelm because it was the name of the Kaiser, but they certainly didn't avoid it. They could have given him a Jewish name. I mean, after all, Goebbels was called Joseph. It's a very good Jewish name. They could have called him that. That obviously went down perfectly well in Germany, but they didn't. They chose a very Teutonic sort of name. And my father was called Rudolph, which apart from being the name of a very famous reindeer, is also a very typical Teutonic sort of German name. And his middle name was Bernhard. That's not a Jewish name. It's the name of a rather fanatical Christian saint. Sorry if there are any Christians who are offended by that, but I've just read that he was. My grandfather had a brother called Isidor Stern, who, as a young man, started to work for a German manufacturer of a cheap sort of brandy. And he did very well. He turned that business into one of Germany's largest manufacturers of industrial alcohol. Now, industrial alcohol is a very important product, but in those days the problem was you could walk into a chemist's shop and say, "Litre of alcohol, please," and for pennies they would sell you a litre of alcohol. And the problem is, pure industrial alcohol, well, you might as well say vodka. It's drinkable, very drinkable, and people did. Germany had lost the First World War. It had had regime change. It had had, for the first time, the kind of representative democratic government which we're used to now. And it's not only in Iraq and Afghanistan that such things failed. It didn't do too well in Germany, in the middle of Europe. It's a difficult thing to do, more difficult than we realize. And they made a mess of the economy. Not only did they have to pay very high reparations to the victorious powers, but they made some extremely stupid, as we now know, decisions to try and get out of paying the full value of those reparations, which had the side effect of ruining large sections of the German middle class. You see, in those days, social security wasn't quite what it is now. And the idea is you work hard, you join a firm, you stay there for the rest of your life and working life, and at the end you hope to get a gold watch, and meanwhile you work hard and you save hard. And that's a lot of your social security, and it was gone. It was a recipe for disaster, and a lot of people tried to dull the pain with alcohol. And Isidor Stern, who was selling the stuff, thought this was a bad idea. And he started to put about the thought that this should be, the sale of alcohol, pure alcohol, like that, to the public, should be stopped. You should either buy it as meth, or you should pay heavy tax. The system we're used to. The other alcohol manufacturers, his colleagues and competitors, were against the idea. I don't know, but I suppose they took the view, I'm not a social worker. I'm a businessman. I have shareholders. My responsibility is to make money for my shareholders. Somebody walks into a shop, wants to pay perfectly good money in difficult times for the product that I make. My responsibility is to sell it to them. And so there was a lot of opposition. But I'm told that ministers of the Weimar Republic government were seen drinking cocktails in my grandfather's brother's, Isidor Stern's drawing room, and he campaigned, and the campaign was successful, and the law was passed. So he made a giant social contribution to Germany. A fat lot of good it all did. Come 1933, and the rise to power of the Nazis, and sometime after, the man walks into my grandfather's business and says, get out. And that was the end of that. A lot of the family fled, mostly to the United States. But there wasn't enough money to get everybody out. It was Isidor Stern who provided most of that money. He didn't have enough for everybody. And my dad got left behind in Germany, but it was a bit more complicated. Because I know that my father was involved in anti-Nazi activity. I know that he kept a pistol in his room, and that the house was searched by the Berlin police. And it's sometimes quite a good idea to have an untidy room. They didn't find the pistol. And I also know that when he went out in the evenings, down his trouser leg would be a length of the steel wire that's used for reinforcing concrete. He was an architect, so I guess he had access to that. So that he could defend himself, because if caught, he might be beaten up and terrible things could happen. He was not a tough guy. He'd had tuberculosis. There were no medicines for that in those days. You had to go to a sanatorium. That's what happened with him. And he was, I remember him as a thin intellectual sort of guy. But he was prepared to do those things. He met a German woman. She wasn't Jewish, but she was also anti-Nazi. There's a story of how she was traveling during the Nazi period in Germany on a crowded train with a little suitcase, working her way along the gangway when the catch came loose. And her little suitcase fell open, and all the contents spilled all over the floor. And what were the contents? The contents were anti-Nazi leaflets. And the next person in the crowd was a brown shirt. That could have landed her in a concentration camp or dead. She was a brave girl. The story, as I've been told it by a lady who is still alive in Amsterdam, who was a great friend of my parents, and she'll reappear in the story, is that my mother was a pretty girl, and the brown shirt just helped her put the leaflets back in. But not long ago, there was a film on Channel 4, Sophie Scholl, about a girl who did exactly that kind of thing with a group of collaborators in the University of Munich. It was later during the Second World War. And a leaflet did drift down a stairwell, was handed to the authorities, and they were beheaded or shot. And rule by terror depends on the population you're trying to terrorize knowing that there is terror about. So people who took those risks knew well enough, not exactly, but well enough, that they were taking an enormous risk. And this girl decided she wanted to marry a Jew in 1938, which was against the law. The Nazis had passed a set of laws called the Nuremberg Laws, which did mainly two things. One is to decide who was a Jew. It wasn't left to the rabbis. I mean, case in point, according to Judaism, I'm not a Jew. According to Hitler's rules, I am. Rabbi Hitler knew better. And the second main thing it did was to forbid marriage or sexual relations between a Jew and a non-Jew. So what my parents wanted to do was illegal under Nazi law. They fled to the Netherlands, which had been neutral during the First World War, and was confidently expecting to be neutral again during any upcoming conflict. They weren't that stupid that they didn't know there was a chance. And to avoid upsetting their nice neighbours, the Germans, they had apparently introduced aspects of the Nuremberg Laws in the Netherlands. I've not been able to track this down, but this is what I'm told by that lady I referred to a while ago who told me the anecdote about my mother. And so my mother had to travel south to Belgium, live in digs for a month to establish technical residence, and then my dad and a couple of friends went south to Belgium, they got married, and they came back the next day. And I was born in the Netherlands. The Nazis weren't bothered whether the Dutch wanted to be neutral, they just invaded. 1940. When it took them a few days longer than they thought it would, they bombed the centre of Rotterdam flat and sent a helpful note to the Dutch government. If you don't capitulate within 24 hours, we will do the same to Utrecht and, if necessary, to Amsterdam. And the Dutch capitulated. Pretty soon, laws were introduced. A Jew could not be a teacher in a school. A Jew could not teach in a university. Okay, so I can't teach in the university anymore, but I've got a head on my shoulders, I can do lots of other things. A Jew cannot work for a local authority or the state. As a postman, a local authority official, whatever, a dustman even. Jewish children can only go to schools that are reserved, have only Jewish children, and Jewish teachers likewise. Jews were taken out of their houses and forced to live in a small part of Amsterdam, which was eventually fenced off, 7 families typically to a house that had previously housed 1. There was a strike in the Netherlands on the 21st of February 1941 by the dock workers and the public transport workers. They weren't striking for higher pay. They weren't striking for shorter hours or longer holidays. They went on strike in protest at the way they saw their Jewish fellow citizens being treated in front of their eyes. If you were a Jew and you owned a shop, then uniformed, organized Nazi thugs could walk in, smash the place up, beat you up, and drag you off to prison. The occupiers knew how to deal with a strike. They shot people dead, 9 of them, and seriously injured a large number of others who needed very serious hospital treatment. And they went into prisons and holding centres and took people in groups of men, groups of a dozen, couple of dozen, more than that, into the coastal dunes or a northern mudflat or a grassy square near the centre of Amsterdam and shot them. Again, remember, terror only works if the people you're trying to terrorise know. It was the largest civilian protest demonstration against the Nazi regime in the whole of Nazi-occupied Europe during the entire Second World War. But the Nazis broke it. It became impossible for my father to earn his living as an architect. He started making wooden toys in the basement of the block of flats where we lived. And I was upset because as a little boy I wasn't allowed to play with these beautiful little dogs and horses and cows made of wood and on wheels with a little string that he made there in the basement. He had to sell them to keep a roof over our heads and to keep us fed. And then my father disappeared. And nobody would tell me where he was. And then at the age of 3, my mother stopped me playing with other children in the street. It was too dangerous for people to know that there was a little boy whose father was a Jew living in that flat. So I lived indoors. And then in 1942, on a darkening November evening, I saw my father for the last time. He came home. My parents were very agitated. My father banged on the wall a prearranged signal with the neighbours. What had happened? My mother had gone into labour. And he'd come home to get me off to some friends, another architect and his wife who they knew, who were going to look after me whilst my mother was in the maternity hospital, and to help my mother get to the maternity hospital. And then he disappeared again. And my mother gave birth to my baby sister. And somebody in the hospital forgot to wash their hands, and my mother got a hospital infection. They happened then too. Only there were no antibiotics, and she died. So there I was. I mean, the couple that had taken me in, they were stuck with me. And my baby sister was lying in the maternity hospital, nobody to look after her. Father in hiding, mother dead. She was adopted by another Dutch family. Sometime before the First World War, a sales rep from my grandfather's business, travelling around the Netherlands, selling women's coats to a shop in a provincial town, came across a lad who worked above the shop making mattresses. He was the butcher's son, and he'd had no more than a primary education, but the rep obviously thought he was a bright lad. And he got him a ticket to Berlin, got him taken on in my grandfather's business where he was trained, and he was eventually set up in a business of his own in Amsterdam with money from my grandparents. And this is probably to circumvent sanctions during the First World War. And this man, by this time, was the sole owner of this business. And he and his wife had had 4 sons. And his wife was so fed up having sons that she dressed the 4th as a girl. And sent him round the garden with a doll, and he became the laughing stock of the village. And here was a baby girl going begging in the hospital, and they took her in. But it was more than that. They already had a live-in maid who was Jewish. And the reason they had picked her was to try and protect her from the Germans. They were already taking the risk. Two years later, I was arrested at school, and the local small-town Dutch police came to the house where this other family lived to arrest my 1-year-old sister. You see, the Germans, by the Nazi Empire, owned a lot of the Soviet Union, Norway, Denmark. They didn't have Sweden, but Sweden was playing along quite nicely. They had Poland, Czechoslovakia, and you can go on with the list. Wherever they went, what they wanted, they took. They had a huge bomber force, vast numbers of tanks, heavy artillery, and you would have thought they had everything. They were losing the war by that stage already, but they were beginning to anyway. But they needed apparently one more thing. They needed my 1-year-old sister, and they needed her dead. And I always offer that as a reflection on the Third Reich to school children who I speak to. Both of us ended up in a prison camp in the Netherlands called Westerbork. It was surrounded by barbed wire. There were watchtowers with armed soldiers in them. I was warned not to go anywhere near the barbed wire or I might be shot. Creosote huts, terrible food, and I was in a hut for little boys and I lost track of where my sister was. She was actually in another part of the same hut, but I don't remember ever seeing her during my time there. And every week, trains of goods trucks and cattle trucks would come in on a rail spur which the Nazis had built with slave labor into the camp to avoid having to march people outside. And they would be stuffed full with people, with the people with whom I was living in the camp. Normal people, decent people, ordinary people, squashed into cattle trucks like sardines. And I could stand there as a 5-year-old watching this process going on, and the people packing them in, there were a few railwaymen, and they were not terribly different from the railwaymen who checked my ticket this morning. And there were a few soldiers. And okay, they were wearing a German military uniform, but I could see their faces. They looked like normal human beings. And stupid and ignorant as I was, it was a puzzle to me at the age of 5 how one set of normal-looking human beings could do that to another set of human beings who I knew were normal. And then the doors were closed and they were sealed shut with steel wire. I'd been on enough train journeys to know that that wasn't normal for a train journey. And then, before the train pulled out, a soldier with a rifle slung over his shoulder would step onto a little iron step that had been screwed onto the end of each truck and hold onto a handle that had been put there for the purpose. And as the train slowly pulled out, with people trying to look out through the 2 little openings in the side of the boxcar, there was an armed soldier on the end of each truck. And even a stupid and ignorant 5-year-old could work out what that soldier was liable to do with that rifle should one of those unfortunate people manage to get out during the journey. Eventually, I was told that the next train I would have to be on. It turned out to be a passenger train. It was green, it had compartments, it had padded seats. It was incredibly crowded. And nobody would tell me where we were going. More to the point, they wouldn't tell me they didn't know. And sitting across from me in the compartment was a woman I didn't know with a baby on her lap, wrapped in a beautiful white crocheted baby shawl. And that, she told me, was my sister, who I had seen a few times since she was born, but I wouldn't have recognized her if I hadn't been told. And I was worried that she would get cold through the holes in the crochet pattern. And the woman tried to reassure me about that. And off the train went, not terribly far. We were unloaded at a huge German railway station. I don't know where. It must have been something like Cologne or Berlin or Frankfurt. I mean, it was a big station. And we were herded into a hall on one of the platforms, told to give up any objects made of metal. I had a little, like a referee's whistle, which I must have had in my pocket when I was arrested at school. And the woman tried to persuade me not to hand it in. I realized that would be risking my life. So I went to the desk. I guess the hall they used was where they had previously had the left luggage office. And a railwayman in a railway uniform took my little whistle off me and solemnly wrote down in a big ledger book that Martin Stern, aged all of 5 years, had handed in this little whistle. And that was the last possession I had, apart from the clothes I'd been arrested in. And then we were shoved into a cattle truck. No room to sit. a bucket, one bucket, as a latrine. Men, women, children. And it for sure wasn't an express train. Sometimes it went normal speed. Sometimes it stood still for long periods. Sometimes it went very slowly for long periods. And the clickety-clack of the rails, in those days we didn't have welded rails, so a different sound remains in my mind. And there was no food. And I don't think there was anything to drink. At one stage during the journey, I remember the door being lowered slightly, so it was a cattle truck, the kind of door that cattle can walk up and down. And the bucket was passed out and in. I guess it was the latrine bucket. But my memory is vague, and it's possible that at that stage I think a little bit of water was passed out, but I'm not sure. My memory is fragmentary. The whole journey lasted, I don't know how long, but it may have been 3 or 4 days and nights. Towards the end of the journey, I remember asking the adults around me why an old man who was lying on the floor of the truck was sleeping with his eyes open. I'd never seen a corpse. Now wait a minute, a moment ago I told you couldn't sit down, and now I've told you that there was a man lying full out on the floor. He was. I don't know the explanation. What I do know from reading is that people did die during those journeys sometimes, and that it seems possible that maybe there had been some other deaths and the bodies had been moved out. I can't tell you the answer, but I can only tell you what I can remember. We arrived at our destination. The door was lowered. The sky was blue, there were a few white clouds, and we were in a town. Not a place of mud and wooden huts, but proper buildings, pavements, roads, grassy square, and in the middle distance an earth rampart with a wooden fence on top of it, and I wanted to run there and see if I could find a gap in the wooden fence to see what was beyond. And I was shouted at, "Don't do that or you'll be shot." I was herded into a group of little boys of roughly my age, and I was pleading for food, and I was told there wasn't any. And I was herded with these boys into a building, so-called orphanage for children who were there without their parents, and kept pleading for food, and I must have been very persuasive because the youth leader, an inmate who was looking after this bunch of little boys, asked a boy a few years older than me to take me into another room where there was a stove which was lit. That's unusual for a concentration camp. And the boy got out a little aluminium pan, and he got about a teaspoonful of rolled oats and a little trickle of water from the tap. And on that stove, he made me a tiny bit of porridge. And that is the most memorable meal I have had in my entire life. I don't know how long I was in that place. I think it was the same day that I was fetched from there by a Dutch woman I didn't know. And she took me to another building. It had been a shop. Everything had been stripped out. And there were just ceiling, floor, walls, shop windows each end onto different streets, and a door each end. And we could see the people on the street, and the people on the street could see the people inside, and on the floor were sleeping places for women, shoulder to shoulder from end to end. It was quite a big place. And there was my baby sister at her sleeping place. She had been to a different building and collected my sister from a whole lot of babies and tiny tots, and collected me from maybe about 50 little boys. What on earth was going on? Well, I have to tell you that at that time I was beyond asking. Also, at the time I was unloaded from the truck, I was beyond thinking where my little sister was. I didn't know. But after the war, she told me the answer. She was in this place. It was called, by the Germans, Theresienstadt. The Czech name of this town is Terezin. And it was a garrison town. It was walled, so it made a convenient prison. It had contained a lot of buildings around courtyards with dormitories for soldiers off those courtyards. So it made an ideal prison for Jews who the Germans for some reason wanted to keep alive for a while, because they were famous and being asked about in the outside world, or because maybe they could be exchanged as hostages, a variety of reasons. And the Germans had ordered a group of professional Jews to do internal administrative duties, such as deciding who was going to be on the next train out. And this woman, who had been incarcerated in this town of Theresienstadt because she had married a market trader in Amsterdam who happened to be a Jew. She herself was from a Roman Catholic family. She was not Jewish. She and her husband were childless, and this troubled her a great deal, and she developed an urge to look after some children. And so she went along to these Jewish counselors, so-called, and said what she wanted, and a man said to her, "There's a train coming tomorrow from the Netherlands. There are 2 children on that train whose father shot dead 2 German soldiers. Why don't you look after them?" How he knew that, how that story got there, I do not know. But I have an independent source in the Netherlands who told me the same story. So from that moment onwards, she looked after us. She moved from dormitory to dormitory to dormitory throughout the remainder of our stay. Wherever she went, she took us with her. She worked in the kitchens. She stole food for us. This in a place where people were dying from malnutrition, and known to be dying from malnutrition, and from the effects of disgusting overcrowding and unhygienic conditions, completely inadequate sanitation. So disease and starvation killed people, and she was stealing food. Another inmate might have believed they were doing a good thing if they shopped her to the authorities. She was risking her life to do that, and she brought us hot food in the dormitories. And so, although other people starved to death, we never starved. I was hungry. I wasn't generously fed, but I didn't actually suffer from real starvation. And there's a whole big difference. From the windows of the dormitories, I could watch again boxcars being loaded up with Jews, men, from Theresienstadt to nobody knew where. And postcards came back from these men for the remaining women. "Don't worry about us, we're working hard, but we're all right." Just one postcard, and then no more. And Theresienstadt gradually began to empty out a bit. And then an announcement was made that women who wished to join their men could board the next train. And would you believe it? The next train was a passenger train. Again, green compartments, padded seats and all that. Nice and clean. And there was an argument amongst the women, should they go? The woman who looked after us, Mrs. de Jong, said, "Don't go. Forget the postcards, those men are dead. If you go, you'll be dead too." Most women went. And in most cases, that meant they went to their deaths. Some went to a lethal kind of forced labor, which a few of them survived. Now, Theresienstadt, apart from the conditions I've mentioned, the bedbugs were a familiar thing. The French word for a bedbug is punaise. Punaise means a bedbug, because the head of a drawing pin is just the same shape and size as a hungry, empty bedbug. But the bedbug crawls out of the tiniest cracks in the wall and the bedding at night and sucks blood. And then when it goes back again, like a little red berry. And there were lots of red splodges on my bedclothes. But it made no difference. There were always more bedbugs. And similarly, fleas. When I see the old black and white films with the comedians with a flea jumping from hand to hand, I know exactly what that's about. Very itchy. There were also lice, but I don't remember having those. It's because they're tiny, you tend not to know it. But there was a big outbreak of typhus towards the end of our time in Theresienstadt, and typhus, which is a highly lethal disease, is carried by lice. Well, when the place had been emptied out to this extent, the Germans supplied paint and brushes and got the shops fitted out as if they were in business, provided musicians with instruments, allowed them to create an orchestra, got plays and a children's opera staged, and arranged a playground for the children, and invited the Red Cross in. And a prisoner was told to run ahead of the Red Cross delegates to give a signal to men driving a cart loaded high with vegetables, which by chance just happened to cross the main road as the Red Cross people were approaching. And then, of course, it drove straight out of Theresienstadt. And the Red Cross went back and reported that the conditions for Jews in the concentration camps were not too bad. There were actually 2 inspections, and they weren't quite fooled to an equal extent. The second one had more insight. Well, on the 8th of May 1945, the Soviet army entered Theresienstadt. The Nazi Empire had capitulated. And by the time I woke up the following morning, the soldiers were already gone. I was very annoyed with Mrs. de Jong for not waking me up and letting me see this, but I guess she'd been kissing and hugging a few Soviet soldiers, and who can blame her? She had brought me a broken compass from one of their vehicles. It's obviously no use to the Soviet army anymore, and she had mentioned me, and the soldier had given it as a toy. It got lost during the journey back, and then started, after a delay for the typhus to be brought under control, a hard journey back to the Netherlands. During one stage, I was walking outside one of the camps where we were housed overnight, about to pick up a round object that I found on the ground when I heard screaming, and a group of little boys came to explain what a landmine was. And in the lorries in which we travelled, Mrs. de Jong was allowed to travel in the driver's cab whilst I was with the other adults in the back, because she had my 2-year-old sister on her lap. And she fell asleep whilst the convoy was travelling during the night against the door, and the door flew open and my baby sister fell off her lap and rolled onto the road as the lorry was moving. I only learnt about it from her the next day, and I didn't know I was going to be a doctor, but I examined her from head to toe, and she had only a few tiny scratches. She just bounced. I don't know. Quite incredible. And she lived to become a quite well-known psychologist at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. And then started a movement from one family to another, and it wasn't always happy. In general, we moved from people we were happier with to people we were less happy with. We were immediately taken off the woman who had looked after us in Theresienstadt, which broke her heart and broke mine. And eventually the woman of one of the families that was looking after us died unexpectedly, and in 1952 both of us came to live with our aunt Eva in Manchester, and I ended up training as a doctor at Oxford University and becoming what I told you at the beginning. So I think that is my story. I've rather overrun, but what does it all mean? When the Holocaust ended, people said, never again. Do you know how many genocides and genocide-like events there have been in the world since after the end of the Nazi Holocaust? More than 50. In general, the world has stood by. The United Nations passed a resolution of the Convention on Genocide, which says what genocide is and what should be done about it. You tell that to the Tutsis in Rwanda. and to the people who were massacred in Cambodia, and to all the victims of communist regimes after the Second World War, and many, many other groups. And then, because it wasn't working, there was a realization that the old idea that what happens inside another country is that country's business and you shouldn't interfere, that idea has its limits, rose to the surface in the United Nations, to the extent that a resolution was passed on something called responsibility to protect. And what this essentially says is that sovereignty is not absolute, that if a government of a country does something unspeakable to a group of its population, and other methods fail to stop this, then other countries are entitled to intervene militarily. So it's a great step ahead. And since then, we've had Darfur, where genocide, because I believe it is a genocide, has been allowed to proceed because it's too difficult to do anything else. And look at Iraq. I mean, the vast majority of people in the United Kingdom are obviously strongly against the invasion, the most recent invasion of Iraq. But there is good evidence that Saddam Hussein was planning genocidal activity against the Kurds, for sure. And he certainly had carried out large massacres against Shia Muslims in his own country. So in practice, these things seem to be far more difficult than idealists in the fervour of their dedication at first imagine. And in general, this phrase, never again, has become a mockery. An American cartoonist drew a cartoon with a caption, "It's never again, all over again." But the picture isn't entirely bad, entirely negative. An enormous amount has been learnt. When I get groups of sixth formers coming to the Holocaust Centre in Nottinghamshire, where I frequently speak, I find that they already know about the experiments of Stanley Milgram, published in 1963 from Yale University in the United States, in which he got people recruited by advertisements, ordinary people, in a laboratory situation to administer what they thought were lethal electric shocks to experimental subjects by having an authority figure around. And this sheds a certain light on behavior in totalitarian and extreme circumstances. So that's Stanley Milgram. And then in 1971, Philip Zimbardo at the University of Stanford got students, people like you. And he allocated them randomly to two groups and put them in a cell. One group were the prisoners and the other were the jailers. And the experiment had to be stopped within 6 days. It became intolerable even for the experimenters. Ordinary people, like we in this room, started behaving in ways, well, recently we've seen it in Abu Ghraib. You know, so again, a similar story. And then in 1992, a guy from the Atlantic Lutheran University in the United States, Christopher Browning, wrote a book, or did the work for a book, which he entitled Ordinary Men. The real title is rather longer. About a police battalion in Nazi Germany from Hamburg, men too old to be sent as soldiers to the front, and they were put in the police, sent to Poland, and told to carry out massacres. And he follows the story through. Some refused. Others did it enthusiastically. And others fell in between. There was a spectrum. But they started off, he argues, as ordinary men. People have disputed that a bit, but I think his point is actually made, even if it isn't absolutely, totally true. So we've got emerging here a picture of evil which is quite different from the ones that most people used to have. We used to think in terms of evil monsters who somehow persuaded people around them to do acts of massive evil. And we now have a concept which is much more frightening. It's us. It is normal people who can behave like that. And we've not yet fully learned how to deal with that. There is more. We used to think that empathy, altruism, the sort of impulses we associate with the great religions, were human characteristics not found in the animal kingdom. But the zoologists, the animal behavior specialists, have now demonstrated very clearly that that distinction is not absolute. And you will find altruistic behavior in chimpanzees, bonobos, and other social animals, even dolphins, for example. There's a fantastic book by a Dutchman called Frans de Waal. His surname is spelled D-E and then a space W-A-A-L, and the book title is The Age of Empathy, and it discusses the relevance of this animal work, in which he is a long-standing and great expert, to human society. The Age of Empathy by Frans de Waal. I recommend it very strongly, published last year. There are other insights. A man called Festinger, who was himself a refugee from Nazi Europe, but working in the United States, came up with an idea in 1971, something called cognitive dissonance. You may have heard the term, many of you will have heard it, I'm sure. And it is the concept that if we have a belief, we hold a belief, but what our eyes tell us conflicts with that belief, we will suffer an discomfort which is so intolerable that we will come up with some explanation to explain why we were right all along. You know, an example might be that you go to a shop and you buy yourself an Apple computer. You get home and somebody tells you, you should have bought a PC, it's much cheaper and there's much more software for it and you can get it help anywhere. Far from being persuaded by the argument that you should really have bought IBM PC compatible, what usually happens is you find all the reasons why Macs are really much better computers. And I've experienced this, and the Mac enthusiasts and PC enthusiasts polarize. It's a very general phenomenon. In fact, Festinger read a newspaper story about a group which preached that the world was about to end on a particular date. A spaceship would come from the planet Clarion and take away the faithful, and the rest would all be drowned in a great flood. And this was going to happen at midnight on a particular date. And Festinger saw in this an opportunity to put his idea to the test. So he went and joined this group, he and his students, and they observed what happened. Well, midnight came, no spaceship. So one of the group looks at his watch and says, you know, my watch is 2 minutes fast. So they all adjust their watches. 2 minutes later, still no spaceships. So they go through all sorts of processes, and eventually about 4 a.m., the leader of the group, Mrs. Keach, goes into a trance, which is what she used to do. And she comes out of the trance and she reveals that miraculously the world has been saved because of the strong faith of the people in this sect. You see, never mind reality. Come up with some explanation that doesn't injure your strongly held belief. And this is not just a phenomenon which occurs in a few fanatics or weird people. It happens in you and me. It's a universal human phenomenon. And in fact, I think it plays a useful biological role. I mean, it wouldn't do for us to be dithering, every time we make a slight decision to spend the next period in agony about whether it was the right decision. There is some sense of it. Now, there's an author who wrote under the pseudonym Sebastian Haffner. He was a German who was trained as a lawyer about the time of the First World War, lived through the rise of the Nazis in the interwar period, and has written very well about that. He became a journalist on The Observer, and then in the 1950s went to work again as a journalist in Germany. And he describes in one of his books how if you were a German at the end of the First World War, after about a fortnight before the capitulation, you would believe that Germany was winning on all fronts. You would in any case have the tradition of Prussian militarism, that there's no nation that can hold a candle to Prussian and German soldiers. It's simply impossible that they could be defeated. And suddenly the Versailles Treaty, a humiliating defeat. Now, what had actually happened was that the generals had been pleading with the government to capitulate because they foresaw even worse disaster if that didn't happen. And then they got out of the way and they let the democratic, the civilian government take the blame for signing the Versailles Treaty. And so this conflict between faith in German prowess and the fact of German defeat gave rise to a conspiracy theory called the Dolchstoss theory. I'm probably mispronouncing it horribly. Dolchstoss theory, yes, slightly better. The stab in the back. It's usually, that's not a literal translation, but it translates the spirit of it. We weren't defeated, we were tricked. We were stabbed in the back. And who stabbed us in the back? International finance. Controlled, of course, by the Jews. Centuries of anti-Semitism. I mean, you should read some of the things that Luther wrote about Jews. Modern Lutherans, by the way, are quite different and don't do that sort of thing. But there was an enormous background of anti-Semitism throughout Europe, but it certainly included Germany. And these two things came together, and of course, having been stabbed in the back, we have to restore Germany's rightful place, and I won't continue the argument too far because I'm sure you can do it for yourself. I mean, these things help to explain bizarre things that happened in Germany. And they turn out, I think, not to be as inexplicable as they might at first seem. So psychology has given us extremely important insights, and many of those insights have arisen since the Second World War, the Nazi period, and the Holocaust. The other lesson of many that we've learned is we think of art as something that refines us, but Beethoven and Brahms didn't protect Germany against Nazis. Neither did Goethe and Schiller. And there is a deep lesson in that. It needs more. So where does that take us? I mean, obviously some questions have been answered. Obviously some practical issues have not, and some theoretical issues haven't either. And there remains an enormous need for academic work in relation to the Holocaust, even though you can fill rooms with books about the Holocaust. We have not learned all we need to learn. And this, there's a famous story about the former president of the Mathematical Society in the UK, who raised a toast at one of his association's dinner, which went, "Here's to the mathematics, and may there never be any use to them." Or the pure mathematics. This is not true of Holocaust studies. It is, of course, like my subject, medicine, a subject which has a practical purpose or it has no purpose. And the purpose ultimately has to be, we don't know how to do it yet, but that in the future, reading, writing and arithmetic and all that is not enough. It is not enough even for our primary school pupils. In the future, in my opinion, every school child everywhere in the world needs to be consciously educated to fight the disease of genocide and mass hatred. As of today, many people are doing the opposite. They are teaching hatred of other nations, of other schools, other countries in their schools and in children's programs. So there is an enormous way to go. But it seems to me that we ain't succeeded yet in making never again something we can say proudly. And that is what we need to do to make it possible. Thank you very much.